Hi, everyone. Thank you all for attending the session today. My name is Katie Ryan. I'm an artist and the organization coordinator at King's Artist Run. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands you might be joining from, and extend a welcome to any First Nations people that are attending the session today. This session is part of a short series of public programs facilitated by Jane Trengrove and myself under the title of Other Body Knowledge. Today's session addresses art and ableism, considering how arts organizations can better support disabled artists and audiences, as well as what disability-informed perspectives might bring to the arts. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping and introductions, and then I'll be speaking again later in the session. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available with closed captioning shortly after the event. We also have offline interpreters and live captions today for deaf or hard of hearing attendees. I'd like to introduce our interpreters, Naomi and Leanne. To activate live captions, please click the link in the chat. We'll be presenting some images along with the talks, and these will all have brief visual descriptions. There will also be 2 5-minute breaks during the session, one at around 2:15 and another just after 3 p.m. You can use this time to get up, stretch, grab a drink of water, rest your eyes, or do whatever makes you feel comfortable to continue with the session. If anyone feels they need to take a break at any time, we encourage you to do so. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please message in the chat and our producer, Zamara, will help you to resolve them. To contact Zamara, you can direct message King's Artist Run or just use the main chat. Please remember to keep your mic muted until question time at the end of the session, when people with questions will be invited to unmute themselves. Also, feel free to pop questions in the chat as they come to mind or bring them up at the end. You can address your questions to specific speakers or to the panel in general, and we'll take a mix of live questions and questions from the chat. This session is part of an Australia Council Arts and Disability peer-to-peer mentorship that Jane and I have been working through for about a year now. But this project has really involved a lot of collaborations beyond the two of us. This session in particular has been developed in close consultation with all the presenters, all of whom are practicing artists with lived experience of disability. In fact, I'm the only person involved in this project who does not currently identify as disabled. Next slide, please. This session is hosted by King's Artist Run as part of an ongoing commitment to increase access across our programs. In May 2021, King's established a new wheelchair-accessible venue in West Melbourne, moving from a completely inaccessible venue in the CBD. This slide shows 2 images of King's Artist Run's new venue. The gallery has a large wooden sliding door painted dark grey and light blue-grey floor. The space is split into 2 galleries and a video nook with an exposed blonde brick wall with high-set windows spanning across both galleries. Now I'd like to hand over to our presenters, Jane Trengrove, Sam Peterson, Lara Shamas, and Faye Ndivi. Sadly, Sophie Kassar isn't well enough to present today, but Jane and I will be incorporating some of her content into our presentations, and we'd also like to acknowledge the huge part Sophie has played in the development of this session. Thanks, everyone. I'll hand over to Jane now.
Welcome, and thank you so much for coming along today. Next slide, please. I am Jane. I'm a seniorish person wearing glasses. I acknowledge that I live on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their peoples, elders past and present. As a child, I contracted polio, and for many years I was known by others as crippled, as handicapped, as a person living with a disability. Now I know myself as disabled, as well as proudly crip, queer, and she, her, they. I've been a visual artist for a long time and have often been preoccupied with how to improve representation of disability in contemporary art. Being othered by disability is deeply uncomfortable and isolating, and this can occur when the atypical body becomes the object of the gaze. As activist Petra Kuppers says, one exists both hypervisibly and instantly categorized. This slide shows several works from an exhibition, Bodysuits, that I curated in 1996 and which toured nationally during 1997. In the 1990s, identity politics was having its moment. I rashly thought disability might get a voice amongst queer, gender, race, and sexuality issues. It didn't follow. When I curated bodysuits, there was almost no representation of disability in contemporary visual art at all. The image on the left shows several works in the exhibition space, and in the foreground, placed on the floor, is a life-sized bed constructed entirely from white paper, complete with mattress and pillow. Titled Sleep by artist Colin Duncan, the work suggests an institutionalized body, sleeplessness, fragility, and the permanent sleep of death. The second image on the right of this slide shows a detail of a work I made for this show called Self-Portrait in Bright Blue. It is a 2-scale model of my leg brace, tightly bound in soft blue mohair wool, inferring smothering and charity craft. I paired it with a small blue monoprint of myself as a child strapped into a full-body splint as a kind of disability history of self. My curatorial decision at the time was to bring together non-disabled and disabled artists of similar level practice to elevate the position of disability and to connect the works via the theme of the body. A central theme of the project was oculocentrism, or the privileging of sight to inform knowledge, with the idea that bodies, and especially disabled bodies, were and are judged due to how they look, but are not known, hence the suit. Because as gender queer theorist and philosopher Judith Butler states, when one lives as a body that suffers misrecognition, insult or harassment, cultural prejudice, economic discrimination, and pathologization, that leads to a derealized way of living in the world, living in the shadows, not as a human subject, but as a phantasm, someone else's phantasm, but you're living it. This expresses what it feels like to be disregarded, to be put aside, to be left out, not considered, etc. Even those who mean well are often doing this without realizing. I have been told that people don't think of me as disabled, which is a double-edged comment, meaning simultaneously that I have met their expectations as equal or able, and rejecting disability, which is the reality of who I am. As an artist, however, the problem concerning what is seen and what is known has been worth investigating and has led to many themes emerging: colonial misrecognition of the land, misrecognition of the natural world, misrecognition of human interaction with other species, and the visual tensions between abstraction and the real. These have all been explored in my practice. Next slide, please. It is this sourcing from a site of experience that may bring forth ideas that offer up all kinds of art making. This slide shows Sydney artist Ruark Lewis walking with difficulty on 2 sticks across a crowded sunny beach. With much effort, he tows a 2.5 metre slender wooden sign with 2 little wheels at the end. Printed neatly onto the sign are the words, "Now people are scared." Ruark's is a diverse and complex practice, and in this work entitled Euphemisms for the Riotous Suburb, he incorporated his atypical body as a spectacle to respond to the Cronulla riots of 2005. As he has said, I was visible, I was invisible. It's not happening, it's absurd. So ableism, how does it play out? The title of our session, Art and Ableism, is a response to the societal difficulties people with disabilities face on a daily basis, and more specifically, the challenge to become represented, recognised and understood in the field of contemporary art, of competitive contemporary art. To say what ableism is in the art world would be to outline a range of systems that discriminate and exclude by an emphasis on an elite individualism. The standardized effects of normalcy and the passive acceptance of how this dominates compound to exhaust the efforts of those of us with disabilities. This is what Sophie Cassar describes as the art world's demand for hyperproductivity. Sophie says, the art world positions itself as anti-capitalist, but has such ableist demands on everyone, including non-disabled people, to work unsustainably and competitively. For my part in today's discussion, we felt it might be useful to address some of the political positions and disability models that have had an impact for disabled people over time. Alongside the number of legislations that sit behind the disability rights movements are the various models of disability, beginning with a medical model, a problem cited within the disabled individual's body to be fixed, and normalized. Then there is the shift to a social model of disability where problems of access and inclusion are no longer cited with the disabled individual, but shared with community responsibility. And then finally moving to disability pride, an embodied identity which demands justice and value. Notwithstanding the many rights-based disability movements, a position of disability seemed to be continually evaded. There has been a persistent antipathy towards disability. It upsets, disturbs, causing it to be denied and turned away from. In part, this explains its exclusion in diversity discourses. Cracking open the hostility has taken time, with public policy shifts, civic responsibilities, and the intention of inclusivity. And it has to be said that enacted diversity policy directives can afford change in institutions. For example, arts funders' disability streams and funding criteria for organisational diversity programs. However, these programs of inclusion often operate as a form of standardisation, and all too often, inclusion means trying to fit people into an existing structure that was never built to accommodate them, rather than changing the structure itself. Next slide, please. Emerging from the disability pride movement comes the expression CRIP, where we rebadge ourselves under the reclaimed name of CRIP, short for cripple, which addresses the common problems affecting our identities of otherness in intersectional collaborations and where we ask for an equal life. Because there is something culturally specific about celebrating disabled bodies that's rooted in pride and in direct opposition to the forces that tell us our bodies are not enough. To CRIP something is to imbue it with disability culture. This slide shows work by British artist Jessie Darling, whose practice tackles the UK capitalised medical system and institutions. We see here a collapsed disability over toilet seat titled euphemistically Comfort Station, and an institutional type vitrine carrying binder files with misshapen legs showing it to be destabilised titled Epistemologies Shamed Cabinet. This next slide, please. This second slide shows two images by Canadian artist activist Carmen Papalia. The first is of the artist unfurling an extra long, 3 metre glow-in-the-dark white cane, a performative piece where he walked through busy metropolitan streets of various locations. Created in 2009, titled Long Cane, this work represents the sense of marginalisation that Papalia felt when he used a standard issue white cane to identify himself, and using it inconveniences others on the street. The other image is of a very large-scale gallery intervention called Provisional Structures, incorporating the elements of a massive sound dome suspended from the ceiling, accompanied by a large spiralling ramp that is scaffolded. The ramp winds up to the ceiling. This ramp, as an art piece, represents an idea of providing support, but also of being uncertain. Not everyone is keen on the term CRIP, and it is not expected that disability is a uniform position. However, there are some elements of CRIP that are useful for all, like CRIP time, which requires a flexible approach to normative timeframes, like work schedules, deadlines, or even just waking and sleeping. And rather than bending disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, CRIP time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. And I'm adding another, which is CRIP ways, where we do things differently. We might not present as career artists. Our studios might exist virtually entirely in our brain or mind. We may rely on a number of helpers and assistive technologies to create work, and with our atypical bodies, we are often obliged to explore alternative means to get things done. Our embodied learning may inform our work politically or not, directly or indirectly, and many times might be the trigger for new work, concepts, and ideas. When we address ableism, we can be mindful that ableism does not allow disability to be other than a deficit with no resources to offer, as a population of people who need help or care. To challenge this requires us to pay attention, to think more deeply, and to make changes in exclusionary practices. A successful approach is to build relationships, which may at first take some effort. However, this is key to creating change and opening up the conversation. As Carmen Papalia says again, accessibility is relational. It's about the way we exist together in space and time. We propose that embodied knowledge has potential for sharing ways of thinking and ways to work. Access to space, flexible time, and appropriate resources, as well as respect and care, will support this. Lara, Sam, and Fayen will expand these ideas with their own perspectives, citing problems and solutions that they have encountered. We invite you to receive our thoughts and ideas, and we hope that you in turn share your thoughts with us. Sam cites respect as foundational for relationships to have meaning. In Sam's words, you need us, and we say we have something to offer. Thank you, and we'll now take a short 5-minute break before we settle into the second part of our session. And we'll come back with the next presentation by Sam Peterson. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That's the end of the break. So next we have Sam Peterson. So if I can get everyone to focus back in.
Truly know yourself. Know your capacity. Know your job. Don't buy. Hi, I'm Sam. You. I don't go by any pronouns. Just call me Sam. I'm 37 years old. I have mousy brown hair and fair skin. I'm wearing a Defend RNDIS shirt. I'm an AAC and power wheelchair user. I am a visual artist, writer, and performer. I am a third-generation white settler of German and British descent. I live and work by the Barrerong on the stolen lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders both past, present, and future. Land that was, and still is being stolen. I was at uni and I was yet again despairing about art venues being so inaccessible. A teacher said to me, but there is not much money in art, which means renting cheap spaces, which tend to be inaccessible. I kept thinking, what is the point if everyone can't come? If I can't come? This was back in 2012. I will be talking about lack of respect in many forms. Slide. Different cut-out letters spelling out the word respect. And a lack of access can be a deep lack of respect. You could say the builders didn't know. I would say they did know. We didn't all appear with the NDIS, but it doesn't have to be fully known to be disrespectful. That's how disrespect works. If you fully consciously knew, you wouldn't do it. But it's saying a few people don't matter. You don't matter enough to be invited, to be included. Everyone's disability is different, and there is no way to predict all of them. Carmen Papalia. But narrow halls and stairs aren't accessible for anyone really, except the most able. I'm so angry that they plead a lack of money, space and time at every turn. How much better and ultimately cheaper would it be if you could include everyone? You would end up more productive. And what is the fucking point of any of it if you are excluding people, us? And I'm sorry, those lifts that are open are so very scary and can only take one chair, slow, and require you to keep the button pushed down, and require you to keep everything inside a line on the floor or it won't go. And often break down. Are not accessible. Slide. Two photos of the kinds of open-air wheelchair lifts. I will get back to that. Respect for others is the most important thing to have, because without respect for others you may as well have nothing. You can have everything else right, but not without respect. You have absolutely nothing. But this respect is so hard to get, and especially when you are a person with disabilities, and even harder when you are a person of color with disabilities. I am white. I will use we and us when referring to as people with disabilities. The factors in this lack of respect are many. There are three I can see happening. Like I stated before, a lack of physical access, and not enough time allocated, and infantilizing. Infantilism is like patronizing, only more accurate. And they all can feed off of one another like a fucked up Ouroboros. Slide. Picture of a snake eating its own tail. Though I have found it to be less than in other areas of my life, this lack of respect is quite marked in the arts, because though it should be in everything, the arts is so much about meaning, and you produce nothing meaningful without respect. It's about conversations, and you can't have a conversation without respecting each other. I love quick time, the right amount of fuck in it, that when I tell people, hey, I need quick time, they tend to not argue. You must respect that I take more time, because it is me. And crip time isn't just me. It's about people doing what they are meant to do around me so I am able to function. I don't know how many opportunities I could have had if people had time. I had an exhibition idea of a stationary disabled protest. I had a gallery interested, but it has faded because of a lack of crip time on the gallery's behalf. Now the fucked up Ouroboros. Often we don't get respect because we take more time. We are expected to fit into, quote, normal time. Therefore, we are not able to express ourselves properly in the time allotted to us. So the view of us is wrong. And this view is put back on us along with social assumptions about us, infantilism. Over and over. Round and round. The amount of non-consensual pats I have got even in the art world is quite disheartening. And all of us can buy this infantilizing, this stereotype about us, to a greater or lesser extent. And we don't want to be stereotyped, so we hesitate to ask for more time and resources, which we need. And because of this, our experience of the world can be less, so we learn less. So society thinks even less of us. Yes, there are disabilities involving the brain, but get over it. This society is so hierarchical, and the brain is the most hierarchical. It is so hurtful. But Sam, isn't it who we are? You may think. No. People's minds are made up of lots of bits of information, a great number of which came from other people's minds. Even the way we see the world is colored by other people. Forgive me if I am stating the obvious, contemporary art. But it is important to be reminded of this. I for one had a very hard time growing up with this disrespect. Back to these scary, slow, impractical lifts. Slide. Same two photos of the open wheelchair lifts. Jane likened them to cattle pens, waiting to be wormed, or I have seen them in many places, old and new. I can kind of forgive them in old places, but I see red in new places. Buxton. I watched it being built when I was in my last few years of art school. I wondered if Melbourne Uni could do with my help on the accessibility, but then I thought, no, it's 2018, they will be all over it. It has one of those open fucking lifts. Fucking hell. And so fucking slow. I was with a group with about 3 wheelchair users in it. The bipeds were down the stairs and out the door like that, and it took about 20 minutes for all us wheelchair users. And it had one of these lovely accessible toilets with a push-button door. But get this. It has an everyday door in front of it. Other times there have been people offering help but not following through. I was encouraged to go bigger with an idea and then left with very little support to release it. They did not respect me enough to remember. One of my friends who also has disabilities had a similar experience. It was to be in a show on resilience. Though the curator had offered in-stall support, come the day there was none, making the completed work not up to artistic standards. A gallery, in an effort to become more accessible to artists by not charging rent, moved upstairs. Going from a wheelchair accessible venue to a non-wheelchair accessible venue. I went to an opening not knowing this to see an exhibition about health. I pissed on their entrances, front and back. And they had the nerve to say they liked it. This liking of my anger is very disempowering for me. They have eventually moved and become accessible again. Why didn't they just move in the first place? Instead of being inaccessible to wheelchairs and so much of society. I was asked to be in a group exhibition. The exhibition was a mentoring program where the gallery mentored an artist with disabilities to curate their first exhibition. I will reference them now as the curator. The person doing the gallery mentoring was not a person with disabilities. The curator chose to do it on the subject of self-reflection of disability, and I was one of the artists chosen by the curator. No dates were set for the exhibition at the time. I was told the gallery would handle communication between me and the curator. I felt a bit uncomfortable about that. The gallery sent us artists the curator's essay they had written for the exhibition for a step proofread. The essay was like half a manifesto. It talked about ableism and femininity, but nothing else. I wrote back to the gallery, sorry, did you think of people of color? I am white. They hadn't mentioned people of color in the essay, and there didn't seem to be any people of color amongst the artists in the exhibition. There are statistically more people with disabilities that are also people of color, I said. The gallery said we'll get back to you. I later did some more research on the disparities between white people with disabilities and people of color with disabilities. I only found documentation of it in Turtle Island, so-called America, but the socio-economic reasons behind it says that it is a worldwide issue and people of color are underrepresented within mainstream disability discourse even more so. I heard nothing for about 3 weeks, and then I got a group email saying that the exhibition was opening on the 1st of the month. I sent the gallery another email again to both threads, with a sick feeling in my tummy. I got back from the gallery, quote, "Sam, hold off a while till we launch on the 1st. Just saying my name like that, no hi Sam, just Sam. Like they were shouting at me. And I felt they were trying to trap me, by not talking to me about it, till after the exhibition had opened. I decided to pull out of the exhibition. But I was too upset to tell the other artists at the time. The gallery then managed to send me lots of emails, trying to get me to reconsider. Why did the gallery suddenly have time to talk? I do not hold the new curator responsible. The gallery wasn't willing to put in the time to have a conversation. But worse than that, they are using people with disabilities to make themselves look good. Very, very disrespectful. I had someone promise me the stars on a project. They said they were going to help with everything and it would be easy for me. I knew disability was a bit harder than that and said so, but they felt confident, and I felt confident taking on the project knowing they would do it with me. I ended up feeling like their side project, and not a very well looked after project. They would say, "So sorry," over and over again. I ended up doing most of the work, which for anyone is not good when they weren't expecting it, but for a person with disabilities it is asking too much. We entered into an agreement they did not really honor. Part of this project was a big idea physically, which they asked me to do. I needed lots of help with it, and said so. They said, "Sure thing, it will be fine, the gallery has volunteers." Then I discovered that the gallery didn't have volunteers. But they had the nerve to put it down as one of the things we learned from the project. But it took more work than expected. And it's this inability to learn from me, a person with disabilities, about something so important, that makes me really fume. They didn't give me their time which they promised. They didn't give me the time I needed, and my health suffered and my relationships suffered. Early in my career in a group exhibition, the gallery hung my work down really low, a foot off the floor. I wanted it at my eye level, but the gallery said it made everyone else's look off. I should have stuck to my guns. It still stings. I know, this is my big chance to get back. But these are just some of the examples I can give, and it's more than that. It's happening to me. And it's happening to many others like me who I know. And I'm guessing, it's happening to many more. How to fix it? Not my problem. But here is some positive stuff. The few times where it has worked, even when there wasn't much money, I had the people's respect and things were able to be worked out. Low roofs make one feel like a mole in general was an exhibition at Riverview that I was part of. They had almost nothing, but they built me a usable ramp. It wouldn't have lasted beyond the show, but they built me a fucking ramp. With Seeing Hands, an exhibition which I really wanted to be a part of, but really didn't at the time, was made possible by the curator being really supportive. And it really helped me that I knew them and had an awesome time with them before on a project. Jemmy Gale's True Colors. Again, I really wanted to be a part of it, but didn't at the time, but this was made possible by the curator respecting me and my work. Akka had the money, which was a dream. I could be a diva and demand what I needed. The people were not bad either and they had the time to respect me. Thanks to Ozco, I have seen the art world can support me after all. JCB, though they had the gall to ask me. After that, they were really there for me. This was just before they became wheelchair accessible. They did this by asking me everything pertaining to me and being honest and open with me. This was so important because it was the most painful show I've ever done to date. With respect, we were able to use these physical discriminations to make a very powerful show. I'm not there. How to do this? How to respect? Truly know yourself. Know your capacity. Know your job. Don't buy into this hierarchical system. And step aside and support.
Thank you, Sam. Next, we're going to have Lara Shamath, and we'll enter the slideshow again, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a 27-year-old Lebanese woman. My eyes, skin, and hair are all different shades of brown. I accent my face with gold round glasses to make my melanin pop as well as see better. My presentation predominantly focuses on how additional lived aspects complicate my disabled experience. These are being a person of color, the capitalism to ableism pipeline, and having what's referred to as invisible disabilities. Next slide. On the screen, I have a quote by Isabella Kress-Nash, which I will now read. Racism and ableism are often thought of as systems of oppression that work separately to perpetuate social hierarchy. Not only does this way of looking at the world ignore the experiences of people of color with disabilities, it also fails to examine how race is pathologized in order to create racism. Society treats people of color in specific ways to create barriers, and these poor conditions create disability. I begin with this quote to highlight a societal separation between the terms racism and ableism. Kress-Nash is here stating that they are not separate at all, more like two sides of the same coin. I want to stress her point that this disconnect between the two systems overlooks the experience of disabled people of color. The last line of this quote refers to systemic forces in multicultural countries such as America or here in so-called Australia, how they create or lead to barriers for people to access care. This is largely socioeconomic, and in my opinion, a third piece to the puzzle, classism, class difference, which I will come back to a bit later. When I hear the term other, I think automatically of the racialized other. This is commonly used academically to refer to a non-dominant culture of a country. Personally, I first came across this term academically in Edward Said's Orientalism, where he speaks of the need to name and create an enemy or opposite, an other, and how historically the Middle East and some surrounds, the Orient, was painted to be the ultimate other to the Western world. This was published in 1978. Post-2001, this idea has solidified and become cemented in the minds of global masses. Only now we call them terrorist. In comparison, other seems polite. Other ultimately refers to a body that deviates from the norm or majority. Being a person of color is an embodied experience, and so is being disabled. Both subjectivities are defined by an other body, which impacts how we negotiate our space and place in the world. Our embodied experience is how the body and brain operates in the world. So naturally, having multiple ways of being othered complicates navigating the world and can produce additional difficulties. Next slide. On the screen is a haphazardly drawn flowchart. The word capitalism has an arrow pointing to productivity, which points to free labor, which points to ableism, which points back to capitalism. In the center, it says vicious cycle, which is circled many times. There is a compounding effect to having multiple marginalized positions, which can include race, religion, sexuality, class, ability, to name a few. People of color in colonized or migration countries such as here may inherently have intersections between their race and their class, whether that be working, lower, or welfare class. This, of course, is not exclusive to just people of color. Things like not having generational wealth or assets leading to housing insecurity, being a laborer working unskilled jobs due to either no access to education or qualifications not recognized in this country. Working to not only support your family, but support a family overseas financially, or having English as a second language, or having a thick accent. Some or all of these may combine to affect health and disability status. We add to this possible cultural shame or health dismissal due to survivor's guilt, putting work over rest to be able to survive financially, cash flow instability, inability to use or access or afford preventative medicines. We can see how these compounding factors surrounding race and class set up an environment to ignore, fail to treat, or diagnose congenital disabilities, as well as fail to recognize or prevent illness and disease from progressing to the point of impairment. Even when we know certain groups have a predisposition for certain ailments, allied health and preventative medicine is largely underfunded. I've personally experienced many instances of a known early stage disease not having pharmaceutical or diagnostic rebates. Only when a disease has entered the irreversible stage was a rebate applicable. Really important to note is how the colonial health system can fall short for people of color. Medical testing and diagnosis qualifications are largely tailored to white bodies, with no variation for things like hair growth, for example. Migrants, refugees, or generations such as myself being the first born here, don't have a medical family history database here that's needed for some cancer and genetic disease testing. Nor do we have knowledge of disease running in the family outside of word of mouth. Understanding the compounding effect of cultural identity, class, and disability is crucial to the next point, choosing between advocacies. Bringing this back to navigating the art scene, there is already a labor in explaining or educating an audience about a practice inclusive of cultural identity. While it is a choice to use aesthetics or topics of such in your work, it doesn't negate the fact that it takes a toll and the pressure systemically placed to negotiate and advocate for the space to just be you as you are. Understandably, there can be a mental capacity for just one advocacy at a time, an internal weighing up of which is more important. What if there's room for only one? Will I be perceived as hard to work with if I ask for too much? In the case of invisible disability, in any body, person of color or not, there can be pressure to lean towards advocacy for the more visible need. Next slide. On the screen, we see a set of bronze cast bones, spine and hip. Surrounding them are green and purple dots. In a zoomed image, we can see the dots are casts of $1 and $2 coins. Having invisible disabilities or living with chronic health conditions may help you to blend in the crowd and avoid certain stigmas, but it does come with its own complicated burdens. It creates an uncertain state of being, where one may be forced to disclose disability or chronic illness and then must deal with the fallout, such as discrimination, exclusion, or patronizing treatment. Suffering in silence and not disclosing may seem like the easier option, even if this is counterintuitive to our needs. Just by looking at me, you wouldn't be able to tell that I've had 5 surgeries to date. I am on the wait list for another, and will most likely have surgery every 2 years for the foreseeable future of my life. You wouldn't be able to tell that I take 7 prescription medications, in which without I would not be able to function. And I look far too young and able-bodied to need to take the lift instead of the stairs. For a primary diagnosis, one of my major conditions, I waited 7 years in pain, not believed by medical professionals or family. Sometimes it's hard to believe what we cannot see, or sometimes we don't want to. Again, even medical professionals can fail in this. For those who are unfamiliar, My practice is largely political, ranging from macro issues to micro storytelling. This is through the lens of my cultural identity. For the most part, I employ a visual language and aesthetics of the Arab and Islamic world. So, what's visible about my practice is my race and religion. So in a scene where I am already taking up space, talking about something so loaded and visible, how could I ask for more? How could I ask for accommodations for something you cannot see? Circling back to how the medical system can fail us, as well as capitalist exploitation of illness, the work on the screen is entitled At What Cost? Political in nature, as my practice aims to be, though not visually indicative of my usual aesthetic. At What Cost expresses a personal story of chronic illness treatment that alludes to greater issues in Australia's public health system. As treatment for severe disease, I was prescribed a drug. The colours of the packaging are replicated in the cast coins. While effective, after 3 years, I was diagnosed with bone density decay, precursor to osteoporosis. I was 24 at the time. I essentially developed a new chronic illness as part of treatment for an initial one. Without my knowledge, I was made to pay thousands of dollars for the destruction of my own body. The medication was not on the PBS. The coins are cast to the dollar amount I spent up until the bone decay diagnosis. The cost isn't just monetary. I paid with my body in a short-lived reprieve from one pain, I gained another. This work represents this tale. It immortalizes the bones now compromised within me and serves as a reminder that our health system can fail us in life-altering ways. Both the initial and subsequent disease are invisible. However, the links between capitalism and ableism are clear as day. Next slide. On screen, repeated is the capitalism to ableism flowchart from before. My fellow presenters have spoken on accessibility issues primarily in a physical sense. I'm going to touch on a slightly more invisible form of accessibility. Accessibility is already an issue in contemporary art, from art school to gallery space. Works can be inaccessible to those who have not studied art, have not read certain texts, are not familiar with certain artist trends or work. You must be in the know, which inherently is a classist and elitist structure. In 2020, in the height of hard lockdown, I was forced to quit my master's after 4 years of working towards it, right before I was due to complete. This was due to inaccessibility, ableism, and classism rampant in the arts. When I was a confirmed candidate, I converted to part-time study to allow myself to enact crib time. Despite being able to do this and exhaust all of my sick and personal leave, an avalanche of complications emerged during the pandemic. And sadly, I was forced to withdraw as no alterations could be afforded to me, despite my transparency of the difficult circumstance of being disabled in a global pandemic. If my disability had been visible, I may have received more support. But then again, sadly, I may not have. A staff member later referred to this as me, and I quote, choosing to quit my master's. This was not a choice. Next slide. On screen, we see a man of brown skin tone's hand softly gripping a woman of lighter brown skin tone's hand. The caption in yellow below reads, "You got the same hands." This still is from a video work entitled, "I Have Her Hands and I Have Her Pain." That is the seed of countless sculptures in my body of work. In this video, my father massages my hand. I reflect on how my hands are sore. We talk about my grandmother, who I didn't get to meet, and my father's acts of care for her. Through conversation, it's revealed how she fell ill and passed away, how I have inherited problem organs and pain, as well as how my hands and spirit resemble hers. My last point is on retelling versus relaying, and how this is important in both cultural informed art and disability informed art. Retelling a story, experience, or narrative that is not your own is commandeering it, possibly blurring the lines between what your lived experience is. Whereas relaying is to never forget your positionality and to make that clear. Not to speak on something that isn't yours to speak about, or use visual language or aesthetics that aren't yours to use. This doesn't mean you can't speak about things that you're not directly affected by. You can speak on wider issues. But there is a fine line to tread between profiting off someone's pain or trauma porn, which you can definitely do to yourself, versus speaking on something with clear disclosure of your position as alongside it or a spectator. As an example, my parents fled civil war. My parents witnessed atrocities too difficult for most to think about. I didn't. When I discuss these topics, it's always from the position of this is what they went through, not me. This is how it impacts how I was raised and how I felt as a child of people fleeing war, and how that experience is different. Third culture discourse is its own interesting aspect to explore. I don't need to commandeer their experience. I can relay their story, include them either visually or their words. And if I want my own feelings in there, I can share how it impacts me as a third culture kid. I'm careful not to retell, because as soon as you retell a story, it begins to change, and there is danger in mistranslation and misrepresentation. Nothing about us without us today means so many things for so many marginalized groups of people. And beautifully tying into my point, this was first used by South African disability activists, Michael Masutha and William Rowland, and later by American James Charlton and David Werner, who were also disability activists. Next slide. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara. Now we're going to start another 5-minute break. So I'll see you all back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Hi, everyone. That's the end of the break. So I'll just get everyone to come back. If we can go to the next slide. So my name is Katie, just for anyone who missed my introduction earlier. I'm an artist and the organization coordinator at King's. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I came to be involved with this project, because as a non-disabled person, my relationship to these issues is obviously different from the other presenters. My first experience with access in art spaces was creating a tactile tour for a group exhibition I organized at King's in 2017. For this tour, myself and the other exhibiting artists considered how works created for a visual encounter could be translated into an experience that privileged language and touch. During the tour, where possible, participants were able to explore the works through touch, providing an initial experience that was autonomous. This was followed by a kind of expanded visual description, outlining the appearance of the works, as well as the concepts and processes involved in making them. Creating this tour asked me to retrace the messy experience of developing an artwork, from its conceptual beginnings to associations revealed by its final form. This is a completely non-linear and often nonsensical process. We created rambling descriptions, allowing aspects of the work to unfold as an eye might traverse the surface. Next slide, please. Ashley Perry described his work Garabu Ganyabara, One for Holding, shown here in this image. We see two floor-based sculptures with angular wooden frames suspending panes of clear glass. The glass is partially framed with exposed curving edges and small piles of pebble-like objects positioned underneath the exposed edge. Ash talked us through the objects collected in these abstracted rock pools: echidna quills, a stone knife, and a ball of white mortar, which was mined from his native land in Quandamooka country, also known as North Stradbroke Island. Passing around these objects and sharing these stories, there was such a sense of attentiveness in the room that it was obvious that a different kind of listening was happening. That was a really beautiful moment that we were able to share through access. So that's a sort of esoteric material or social aspect of access that I found really interesting. I've also found reading disability or crip theory very engaging for a number of reasons. Writers within this field are somewhat beholden to accessibility, so texts don't tend to use a lot of highly specific terminology or be written in a generally impenetrable way. That style of discourse isn't very accessible for people who don't have a great deal of leisure time, the bodily and mental capacities to sustain long periods of reading, or access to texts and the education to assist in decoding those texts. Disability theory also tends to remain somewhat tethered to the material conditions of the world, and I mean material to include economic, social, and cultural conditions. This is in contrast to a lot of other streams of philosophical thought that might venture completely into the abstract, which, as we all know, is a lot easier to do when your immaterial needs are already met. A lot of the disability theory I've read has included really on-point critiques of neoliberal and capitalist structures. These are arguably even more harmful to disabled people than other groups, due to this group's high level of reliance on state support and need for assistance to navigate a largely inaccessible world. Not to mention the intersections of disability, race, gender, sexuality, and of course class, which Lara covered in more detail. It seems to me that often the people who a certain structure is not built to support are the ones who can see its operations the most clearly. This is what is known just through living it. One idea that I found very interesting and that leads into some of Sophie Cassar's writing, which I'll be discussing, is the idea of compulsory able-bodiedness put forward by Robert McRuer in his book, Crip Theory, Cultural Signs of Queerness and Disability. Building on Adrienne Rich's famous essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Experience, McRuer discusses how able-bodiedness masquerades as a non-identity, the natural order of things, in effect producing disability. McRuer highlights that the Oxford English Dictionary defines able-bodied, quote, redundantly and negatively as having an able body, i.e. one free of disability and capable of the physical exertions required of it. So able-bodiedness is described as the absence of disability and particularly relates to the capacity to work. Without getting too far into the complexities of this idea, I'd like to quickly outline how this could relate to an idea of standardization. If all bodies are assumed to enter the world as able-bodied, heterosexual, and with an assigned binary gender until proven otherwise, and in some cases this process of proving is extremely violent, especially when recognition is required by the state. If we could approach each other with more flexibility and assess needs and pathways as they arise, we might avoid a lot of pain. I'll note that the kind of flexibility I'm proposing here is definitely different from a neoliberal flexibility, which relates to casualized labor and a performative tolerance or tokenization of difference. McRuer also describes this in a really interesting way, but I'm going to run out of time, so please look him up. So this brings me to Sophie's research. In her paper, The Medicalized Individual and Disabled Collectivity, Sophie was looking at the relationship between disability, collectivity, and neoliberalism. The way I'll be summarizing this text is based on my impression of it. It's definitely not an exhaustive or objective account of her research, although I will flag that I have her consent to share it with you. Sophie quotes disability scholar Michael Oliver as follows. Slide quote, please. This quote is displayed in dark gray text on a slide. Oliver writes that individualism is the ideological foundation upon which capitalism was built, as demonstrated by the requirement for individuals to become a commodity for sale in the labor market, necessitating what Oliver describes as a break from collectivist notions of work as the product of a family and group involvement. The most obvious example of this being wage labor, but this is intensified by widespread use of competitive systems within quote unquote team environments, such as KPIs, bonuses, commissions, and ranking systems. This means that output is segregated to the individual and often measured against others to encourage competition and a feeling of job insecurity for those with lower performance indicators. Sophie also points out that the medicalized model of disability that Jane outlined before is in fact an individualized model, of which medicalization is just one factor. So again, this is a framework that cites issues as individual rather than collective, regardless of how many people they might affect. This neoliberal individualization has also absorbed identity politics in a way that maximizes division and inhibits collective action. This serves to effectively distract from massive wealth inequalities. Within this context, I was struck by the openness and generosity with which Sophie approached discussions of disability in her writing and in our conversations. Earlier in the session, I flagged that I am someone who does not currently identify as disabled. This particular phrasing is an attempt to acknowledge the wide spectrum of disability, and that disability is the one minority group that we will most likely all come to occupy at some point in our lives. This expansion of the term disability can be a productive opening up and an acknowledgement of the relative slimness of the category of able-bodied. Although this expansion does run into some rocky territory when it comes to specialized funding streams and support for people that may exist on this incredibly wide spectrum. But this is just another failing of the blunt tool of categorization and the tick box approach. Leaving aside how many people may or may not identify as disabled, if we acknowledge that ableism is a system that affects many people negatively and that it asks for adherence to a mythic norm that very few people actually embody, it starts to open up the conversation on how we can all work to shift this and perhaps work towards an approach that is more truly collective, where strengths are combined and shared to reduce the pressure on everyone. And also where maybe we just produce a lot less, actually allow things the time they require, and maybe also pay people properly to do them. That would be nice, right? In the context of the art world, Sophie referred in her writing to a Berlin-based artist collective called the Feminist Healthcare Research Group. They're not an explicitly disabled group, but came to disability through their research on feminist healthcare. A key idea proposed by this group was that if we understand ableism as a structural factor underlying the art field, the bodily and psychological pressure that it induces becomes a collective issue rather than an individual failing. The Feminist Healthcare Research Group resists an ableist culture of hyperproductivity by maintaining the physical and emotional capacities of the collective as a primary concern in the methodology of their practice. This means that the mode of operation is adapted to suit the group, rather than the group being exhausted by attempting to meet the expectations of the environment. Sophie applies this approach in her own research, working within her means or with the assistance of others. Slide, please. Here we see a slide with an image of an artist book by Sophie Cassar titled Sick Girl Aesthetic. The image shows hands with pastel blue, the image shows hands with pastel blue-gray painted nails holding a closed book. The book cover is a composition of images in muted tones. The larger image shows an institutional setting, perhaps a waiting room. A smaller image with a subtle drop shadow seems to float towards the right-hand corner, showing a person dressed in all white, including white slippers, and holding a large black handbag and a grey metal crutch. To wrap up and to propose a potential way forward, I'll quote Sophie quoting Alex Martinez-Rowe, who has proposed an idea of solidarity in difference. This is a way of being and acting together that doesn't require complete consensus or the same identity. Sophie referred to this as affinity politics. This is a way of approaching issues and others, not by asking, are we the same and are our ideas totally aligned? But do we have common problems or do we have common goals? Thank you. And now I'll pass along to Fayen.
Kia ora everybody, I just want to check that you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, kia ora, I'm joining you from Jarrah country, where it's very wet outside at the moment, but the wattles are heavy with flowers and the birds are busy building nests. As I talk today, I just wanted to let you know that I'll often look to the side because I do use a screen magnifier that sits on my left here. Also, I don't have prepared remarks today because I asked Jane and Katie if I could approach this talk as an improvised response that aligns with a method that I've been working with for a few years, a performative method of blundering, of stumbling blindly into uncertain terrain. And I realize this means that what I have to say will certainly not be as eloquent as the speakers that have come before me. It's certainly not going to be well crafted or, I suspect, even well measured. But given what I feel like I'd like to say, I think that this lack of perfection and a vulnerability to a raggedness of emotion is actually political. I had intended, and I will talk about ease of access in the second half of my time. I have set a timer for myself so that I can remember to shift to that exciting and joyful side of access. And I want to do that because I do want to share with you my real love of access, and also because I think I'm going to need to close on an uplifting note. Before I talk about that though, before I talk about ease of access, I want to talk about unease. I had the privilege of listening last week already to Jane and Sam and Lara giving draft rehearsals of their presentations. They weren't exactly the same as today, but certainly they gave me a sense of what was going to be discussed. And those presentations then and today affected me really deeply, and I wanted to honour that impact, to honour the privilege I had of listening to those powerful points being made about lack of respect, about exclusion, about the intersections between ableism and capitalism and so on. And in part, it's true that the impact is because I think of moments that I have felt unwelcome, belittled, tokenized. I think of how often I say, no, I'm not going to an event, not because I can't, but because I just don't think that I will enjoy it. There are too many ways that the galleries and institutions of art and structures of art education in Melbourne exclude disabled bodies that I just find it unbearable often. So I exclude myself from those and I go at a time when it's not an opening, when I can take things at my own pace. But the other reason why I was really uneasy after listening to some of those points, some of which you've heard today, is because I've been immersing lately in archival speeches and documents that relate to the history of eugenics in Victoria. And I have become deeply troubled about the ways that contemporary ableism is a kind of a spectre of eugenics, is a contemporary haunting of eugenics. I've put some notes from my research up here. They're not in the form of the speech. They're not in the form even of written sentences. They're not even in the form of some sort of cohesive narrative. But I've got sort of quotes from various sources, just so that I can recall some names and dates and quotes, even if I'm nervous, because I get nervous when I'm speaking, or if I start to get angry because of what I'm speaking about. So I'm just going to shift through to those completely disorganized notes. If you could see them here, you'll see what a mess they're in. Okay, so what I thought that I would like to do is to talk my way through, well, where did this concept of a normal body come from? And then I want to shift into statistics, enforcing normality, ableism, and so on. So first of all, it's actually prior to the 1800s, so relatively recent, that the adjective normal was mostly used in a mathematical sense, like in carpentry, to indicate a perpendicular measurement. And its etymological origin is the Latin normalus, which means a right angle. And during the 4th and 5th centuries, sometimes that shifted into being conforming to a rule. But though there are scattered occurrences, since the 1500s of normal referring to a type or a standard, it's only in the 1840s that the idea of normal as an average comes in. And it's only later in the 1880s, relatively recently, that normal's used to describe a person who is physically and medically sound, free from disorder and healthy. And so the process by which normal has become entrenched as a term that describes a body can be traced to the beginnings of statistics. And it's entangled from the outset with eugenics theories. So very quickly to run through some of that and then to get to the Victorian context. In 1749, a German political philosopher, Gottfried Achenwall, uses the word statistic to refer to the compilation of information about the state. Now, English writers apparently had used similar concepts, but it was Achenwall who popularised the application of what he described as a new political arithmetic, and he applied it to analyses of agriculture, manufacturing and commerce in Europe. And in 1829, the use of statistics migrated from the state to the body, when an English physician, Francis Bissett Hawkins, talked about a medical statistics, which could involve the application of numbers to illustrate the natural history of health and disease. Now, incidentally, he was later appointed an inspector of prisons and then the commissioner of Pentonville Prison, which all of Victoria's bluestone prisons were modelled on. And, you know, for reasons that I can go into another time, that's really important. In 1835, a French statistician and astronomer, Adolphe Quetelet, he noticed that the notion of a law of error, which was used by astronomers to locate a star, and that involved plotting all of the sightings of where a star might be, and then they averaged those errors. And then the kind of what came in the middle of this bell curve was the most likely place of the star. He suggested that this could be actually adapted to humans and to the distribution of human features such as height and weight. So he took the law of error from astronomy and he applied it to the body. He then took it a step further and he formulated the concept of l'homme moyen, or the middle or average man. And he wrote that for the l'homme moyen, all things will occur in conformity with mean results obtained for a society. And if one seeks to establish the basis of a social physics, as it is he who one should consider. So this is the shift of social policy through to the norm, to the middle. This average man was presented by Quetelet as a combination of a l'homme moyen physique, a physical body, and also morale, a moral body. His concept provided an exemplar for a middle way of life, and it established the idea of the classe moyenne, or the middle class. He also argued that deviations more or less great from the mean have constituted for artists ugliness in body as well as in morals, and a state of sickness with regards to the constitution. He established a path for eugenics thinking, saying that the more enlightenment is propagated, the more the deviations from the mean will diminish. The perfectibility of the human species is derived as a consequence of the disappearance of defects and monstrosities, a disappearance of the extremities of the norm. It was Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, who built on this concept to propose that the law of errors could be renamed a normal distribution curve and applied to all human traits, including intelligence. He divided the curve into quartiles, which he termed standard deviations. The upper quartile was the most desirable, and the lower the least. His normal distribution curve presented a new ideal of ranked social order, and it provided a mathematical and a scientific basis for social policies dedicated to elevating the middle class through judicious mating, he said, as well as the elimination of the lesser quartile deviations and the encouragement of influences that would give to more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing. He proposed a new field of study devoted to the science of improving stock, which he called eugenics. He published those ideas in 1880 and delayed publicising them until 1901, not only because hereditary genetics was blossoming then, but also because the Boer War was causing panic about Britain's national efficiency, racial health, and the empire's future. Now, eugenics swiftly gained traction in Australia, where eugenicist logic found a receptive audience amongst white colonists who already feared racial dilution. Now, many of you will know of the role that Victoria played in the global eugenics movement through the research and advocacy of Richard Berry from the University of Melbourne. His medical statistics study centred on establishing a hierarchy of worth to support the claim that those with disability, most criminals and social misfits, all Aboriginals, and a variety of non-white races, especially Asian, fell below an established norm of a 14-year-old white Australian boy. Now, I think one of the dangers of the attention that's been given to Richard Berry is that it downplays the extent that his views were across and supported by Victorian society. It was a trust of the Argus newspaper that funded Berry's travelling lectures across Australia in support of bills that went through the Victorian Parliament encouraging eugenics logics. In 1925, he warns at the University of Melbourne the danger of allowing the feeble-minded And he includes this to mean not only those with mental disabilities, but also blind and deaf and many others, to send into the world fresh supplies of subnormal blood. And to give a sense of the support of some of this, the president of the Housewives Association said there were 3 things needed to give us a clean society: the elimination of drink traffic, education and health, and the segregation of mental defectives. And she said this will never be possible until there's a large band of women in politics. This is important because of the role that feminist suffragettes played in eugenicist policies. In 1921, there's a proposal in the Workers' Education Association newsletter that advocates sterilisation of mental defectives, possibly by the establishment of a lethal chamber. And note, this is prior to the German use of lethal chambers. In 1930, Berry returns to Britain and he advocated a similar proposition. And when he was challenged, he basically said he'd been, hadn't been serious, but nonetheless, an act of extinction would be the kindest and wisest thing that we could do. Now, I wanted to talk about this because the focus on Berry's role, I think, has arguably diverted attention from the extent to which the elimination of disability has been supported across the political spectrum. Eugenics Society of Victoria members included the oncologist Peter McCallum, the publishing magnate Sir Keith Murdoch, zoologist Georgina Sweet, who was president of the YWCA, Frank Tate, the first director of education of Victoria, and many others who played key roles in establishing the structures and services that we work within today. And indeed, when the Nazi sterilisation laws were announced and condemned across Europe, in Melbourne, the Argus and the Age newspapers reported the laws without editorial comment. They reported that it applied to those with feeble-mindedness, insanity, blindness, deafness, dumbness, and deformity, and those with mental irresponsibility. And then they praised Hitler as an abstainer and a non-smoker. So no condemnation. And throughout the 1930s, it is here in Victoria that that people continue to applaud the German experiment. As I said, women's groups are very involved. They urged the government to establish residential centres for the mentally defective children and separate colonies for feeble-minded adults. In 1933, the National Council of Women urges the Minister for Health to prevent mental defectives from reproducing their own kind, and thus creating expenditure by the community on welfare work, jails, and mental hospitals. And I think this is important to note because of some of Lara's comments about the entanglements of Evelyn with capitalist imperatives. Quetelet's concept of the average man was cited by Marx when he formulated his labour theory of value and constructs of the average worker and the average wage. And indeed, in his book Enforcing Normalcy, that comes from a deaf perspective, Leonard Davis argued that Marxist thought encourages us towards an enforcing of normalcy in the sense that deviations from society in terms of distribution of wealth need to be minimised. I don't have time to continue the theme of how well supported eugenicist views were, but amongst the medical establishment, it was seen as the most profitable and sound form of preventive medicine. The Mothers Club of Victoria voted for voluntary sterilisation of the mentally and physically unfit because they said they needed to ensure in Australia there should not only be a white race, but a race of the best whites. This goes on and on. In 1937, doctors in Tasmania recommend sterilisation of those with hereditary blindness. And the same year, the Commonwealth National Health and Research Council recommends the prohibition of marriage for those who have blindness. Now, by 1960, because of what happened in the war with the lethal chambers, many proponents of eugenics were distancing themselves rhetorically from the movement. For example, in New South Wales, the Racial Hygiene Association changes their name to Family Planning Australia, and their official history now barely references their role in the movement and extricates their most radical proposals, including a 1932 speech in which their president opposed the state providing food to those who are defective. In the post-war period, lethal chambers and legal compulsion of sterilisation of those with disability and exclusion were no longer perceived as practical given shifting public opinion. So they moved away from the idea of colonies of the disabled so that eugenicists instead could focus on public health and education measures. If you look at all of the key Victorians involved in public health and education, it is very hard to find somebody who wasn't a eugenicist. And indeed, the legacy of eugenics remains via the trade colleges, which were explicitly established by Director of Education Frank Tate as a mechanism to keep the unfit separated from the fit. So they established the secondary trade colleges, that were free and that, many people could go to. And they brought in high fees for private colleges, which they got the church to run, as a way of keeping them apart. Now, recalling the roots of statistics are entangled with eugenics, I want to propose here that a spectre of eugenics haunts the persistent ableism within museums and galleries, and especially here in Victoria. I argue that this can appear when galleries and museums of art privilege metrics of visitation that seek to appeal to a mass audience of the normal distribution curve via the middle class or l'homme moyen. I also argue that this haunting surfaces in smaller art spaces that may be less concerned with metrics, but who excuse failures in disability access on the basis of unstable or absent human and financial resources, except for specific disability-focused exhibitions. I suggest that this reenacts the othering and the segregation of disabled bodies and the ethos of eugenicist Victorian suffragettes, whose progressive politics were constrained to their own rights and voices and dismissed unfit bodies as unnecessary, including blind and deaf bodies. I know we're really short in time, so I ended up getting lost in a lot of that when I wanted to talk about access beyond compliance, access as welcome, access intimacy, access as a temporary collectively held space. I wanted to talk about, Mia Mingus's notions of access as a long, slow exhale and unspoken instinctual language, something that brings people closer and builds and deepens connection. I wanted to talk about how she says that access intimacy doesn't mean that everything's 100% accessible. We don't need to strive for perfection, but sometimes it just looks like all of you trying to create access as hard as you can in an ableist world. And sometimes it's just somebody sitting and holding your hand while you stare back in that inaccessible world. Because I know that I must be over time by now, I'm not able to do these things. So all I want to do in the last closing minutes is to tell you what I would have talked to. I would have talked to Carrie Standell's work considering disability, and I can leave links for all of this in case you're interested. She talks about access as generative. Lived disability as a state of being that once destigmatized allows for complex understandings of bodily, spatial and social considerations. And in particular, I had wanted to use the words of Jennifer Justice from a forthcoming article, Disabled Artists, Audiences, and the Museum as the Place of Those Who Have No Part. And she talks incredibly compellingly about what can disabled artists bring to 21st century curatorial practice and exhibition spaces? What is our responsibility in a dominant cultural milieu that often restricts or denies access to its spaces? But ultimately, what she comes to, this idea that she draws on Rancière to say that there is a radical wellspring of agency available to disabled artists, that museums have the potential to become collaborative peer laboratories for recentering communities around an expanded understanding of social belonging and cultural agency, with all the rights and privileges that such kinship would bestow. She talks about a growing cadre of contemporary disabled artists that use the tools of their crafts to liberate disabled art patrons from harmful assumptions about how bodies are welcomed and accommodated in art spaces. And she talks to new collaborative frameworks for designing accessible exhibitions, which fortunately include some of the ones that she and I have worked on together. So even though I'm unable to talk to you about all of those things that I had wanted to talk to you about, what I do have is a variety of links that during question time, I'm going to drop in the chat so that those of you who are interested can follow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fayan. Okay, so now we're going to begin question time. So if anyone has a question, you can use the raise hand function to ask directly, or you can pop it in the chat. We're happy to receive like feedback, responses, anything that you would like to say.
Hi, Jane here. I just wanted to thank Fayan for that wonderful blundering. It wasn't blundering to me. what you said. It was really interesting. And I'd just like to ask you if you could, I know you didn't think you had time, but we do have time, to just talk a little bit about the collaborative frameworks that you have been working on. As you know, part of the challenge to the usual way things are done, and the writer that you mentioned that you have worked with.
Yeah, so I've just popped a few things in the chat there. There's a Vimeo that didn't kind of come through as a link, sorry, which is a lecture that I commissioned from Parman Papalia. It was part of my West-based talk, which is freely available as a resource for anybody. I put in some links to Mia Mingus's talks about access intimacy. And then the last one there, but I'm going to drop in some more things, is the upcoming article from Jennifer Justice, and who's worked with me. There's a description of one of our projects that I wrote for SF MoMA, redescribing the periphery. In this one, I mean, this is a good example of where, you know, this argument that you don't have time or money doesn't really fly, because in this case, SF MoMA flew me into a Via Chalmers show. I saw it the day before the workshop. I realized this was really difficult because, you know, the works were incredible. They were mostly behind glass or so delicate they couldn't be touched. But I came up with a whole series of ways that we could do descriptive experimentation and kind of simulation of the strategies that Via Chalmers took when she was drawing as ways to open up conversations around those artworks. Another example of this kind of low cost ease of access is this thing I'll drop in the chat now, which is a website that I worked on with some of my students for Take Hold of the Clouds, which many of you might have experienced across Melbourne, for Open House Melbourne. And I did the visual describing workshop for Kings associated with that. There's all sorts of interventions there that we were exploring as how can you offer to a temporary exhibition, you know, ways of expanding welcome. So there are things like asking that any of the catalogue texts were read. And I think in most or all cases, they were actually read by the authors. So that provides a really beautiful way of hearing texts that, you know, would be in a printed catalogue. We had live captioning of a radio streaming. You know, there's all sorts of information that can go up on a phone. And even when, you know, we made mistakes or, you know, when new opportunities came up for expanding access, we were able to update things on our phone, like image descriptions at the last minute and things. So there's all sorts of ways that you can build access and, you know, to shows. I think that there is this feeling like, you know, actually, I think, Lara, when you were talking about economics, I think that is right on. And that is really problematic because so much money goes into access interventions that are not necessarily the best. And so one point that I really hoped I could have time to make, and I just would like to make it, is I'm really frustrated with people who will say, oh, you know, in relation to access or diversity, what do you do? Oh, well, I listen to others. And I've become troubled by this because to say that, oh, I listen is immediately to other, to say it's also very passive. It's not saying I'm going to look at myself and figure out how am I complicit. It's also not saying, here, I've got these resources available. How can we best use them to expand and invite the collective temporary community we want for this show? So I just really want to argue for people. Yeah, listening is better than telling people what to do, but it's really not enough. And it's reperforming this kind of silence and this holding on to resources that I think Sam and Lara and others spoke to so importantly today.
I can see a raised hand in Amy Mills. Can we take that question?
Hi everyone, my name is Amy, she, her on Gadigal Wongal land. This question's really for Sam or Lara. I'm just really interested when you go to get funding for projects, specifically if you're a disabled artist, a lot of the funding I find across Australia is mentorships, which I think infantilizes disabled artists. And I want to just get your thoughts or just comments on why we only have access to mentorships, whereas like other artists, that's not the case. I mean, I've been to university. I have been a practicing artist for 5 years. I actually don't need a mentorship. I would like the funding without a mentorship, but they sort of come hand in hand.
Mm.
I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it's really silly that is the. I mean, I personally don't go for those things because exactly right. I don't need a mentor, and the mentors usually aren't disabled people. So I don't see what, like, I don't know. It is incredibly patronizing and infantilizing. So I guess personally, it's just like go for regular funding. Yeah, but that sort of erases like that we actually have extra needs and need extra support. That's just a big gap and just another big gap in the arts. Yeah.
Sam is saying something.
Have just got a job as a mentor. I have just got a job as a mentor.
That's incredible, Sam. I'm really happy to know that.
You'll be a great mentor.
Yeah, very. I'd just like to respond to Amy. I think how Katie and I handled this mentoring stream from Australia Council was to go peer to peer. So it's not like you've got, someone kind of as the more superior practitioner, but it was just peer to peer, and that worked well because we could collaborate. And sometimes, the funding streams are limited, and it's on you really to find the way to make that work. It falls back on us, and I absolutely hear what you're saying. And another thing I'd like to say is because disability practice is so underdeveloped, sometimes the mentoring thing can help. Having been a mentor with other disabled artists many times, it was really fantastic to work together, and they're still friends and we still share, and it's an ongoing relationship when it works. So yeah, it's patronizing, no doubt, but then on other ways, sometimes you have to find ways between the cracks to make it work. So, if there's someone you really like who's an artist who you'd like to work with, you could always approach it as a team. Or, I think collaborations too, when applying for funds, can strengthen. When you have a disability, it can certainly strengthen your capacity, which is often what we need, extra support to make things happen.
Responding to that, I think the idea of mentorship comes out of we need extra support, but that might be funding for a support worker for us.
Yeah, I agree.
I feel like it's honestly institutions not actually understanding what disabled artists actually need, and so they're just like, here's a mentor. So that, and I'm not against mentorship, like you have it in university structures and everything like that, and it can form really great partnerships and relationships. It's just, I personally find it patronizing, and I wish there was extra funding in those streams to be like, do you need a support worker?
Totally
fair enough. Yeah.
The only funding that I've only ever received funding once, And so like in my proposal, it was like non-disability specific. I budgeted for things like transport, install assistance, all of that kind of stuff. When, you know, I could have been asking, like, that's what I applied for the funding for, when I, you know, could have and should have been asking for, like, you know, materials and like an art, like a decent artist fee and the, you know, things to actually make the work. Yeah, it's silly. I don't know. Like, I agree. I guess I don't have anything else. Sorry.
There's also a question in the chat for Jane about how the bodysuits from 1970 or 1997 was received.
Yeah, well, it's actually a really good question because at the time it wasn't really received at all. I just don't think people were ready for what we were trying to do with it. It was called bodysuits, and we were criticised because there was no actual bodies in it. All the artists had removed the body as spectacle, the non-disabled artists and the disabled artists, and had sort of inferred the body by the works on view. So it toured, and it was touring in well-received, publicly funded contemporary art spaces. But in terms of what I'd hoped for, which was something that got inside a perspective or a different way of approaching things in a perceptive way, that did not seem to resonate at the time. But it did go well at the Experimental Art Foundation in South Australia. That was a really good, that's what the slides are from. It had the space for the works to speak, and it had a very receptive team at the EAF. And there was more that I would have liked to have done with it. It was difficult also to find accessible venues everywhere. And it was unfortunately opened in Melbourne at Gertrude Street Studios, which at the time had 2 steps up the front, and we had to do an awkward temporary ramp thing, but we did do that. But I had actually wanted to construct a full-on ramp outside the gallery on the footpath. But at the time I was a bit naive about public bylaws, so that was not possible, but I wanted to make it a feature of the show. Anyway, that's how it went at the time. Anyway, things have changed a little, thank goodness. So that's my response.
We could probably do one more quick question if anyone has one, either in the chat or if someone wants to jump in. Okay. You're also welcome to, if you want to get in touch with any of the presenters, to ask questions afterwards. And also Sophie Cassar has said that she's happy to have her email passed along. So you can email the info@kingsartistrun.org.au address. I think that's on the final slide as well, if we pop that up. And we also just want to flag that there's one more session coming up, which is on Saturday the 27th, and that's Deaf Culture and Awareness with Luke King. We'll be opening bookings for that soon. And then on the 15th of September, there'll be an exhibition opening at King's that Jane and I have put together, which will be very exciting. Jane, did you have anything else? Oh, and obviously, thank you so much to all the presenters.
Yeah.
It was really incredible to hear all of the perspectives.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone who spoke, and I just think it was really wonderful. And thank you to the wonderful audience who've been part of this today. I really thank you for your time and for your attention.